Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of TES Magazine's Leading and Learning webinar series. I'm Paul Spires, I'm host of the New P&L Principles and Leadership in Business podcast, and I'm founder of the New P&L Global Leadership Network. And I've been invited to host this fantastic 10-part series exploring leadership in the learning sector and in the education sector. And we'll be focusing on insights, inspiration, and innovation for senior leaders right across the education sector, as well as those that want to develop their leadership skills and help to transform their organisation. We've got a phenomenal lineup of guests over the next 10 episodes for you. And we'll be kicking off the series today with the incredible Owen Eastwood. Owen is a renowned performance coach, and he's worked with some of the biggest names and brands right across sport and business, including the English football team, South African cricket team, and even Nato. And many of you who are watching this webinar will also recognise that Owen is the best-selling author of Belonging, the Ancient Code of Togetherness. So Owen, a very warm welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, wonderful to be with you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps for those who aren't familiar with your work, let's start with a quick introduction to what you do and who you do it for.
Okay, well, I'm a performance coach. I was actually formerly a lawyer. I worked as a lawyer for about 15 years and was a partner in a London law firm at one point. Then I transitioned quite accidentally, really, to become a performance coach. So I'm well known, I think, in the sports area. I work with, as you said, Gareth Southgate and the England football team for the last 6 years, and previously the South African cricket team. I'm also working this year with the European Ryder Cup team. They've got the big golf challenge against the United States in Rome in a few weeks. But I actually spend most of my time working with corporate leadership teams and have increasingly spent time connecting with the educational sector over the past 12 months, which I've really, really enjoyed.
Excellent. The Maori concept of whakapapa underpins much of the work you do around belonging, and it sets a framework, if you like, for the delivery of it too. So it seems a great place to start. Could you outline the principles of whakapapa and why you believe it to be one of the foundations to belonging, if you like?
Well, I suppose everybody listening, nobody can really understand the way you actually work unless they understand a bit about this story. And so for my coaching is really much an exemplification, I think, of my own story. So when I was 5 years old, my father passed away very suddenly. He was only 41, and he was an only child, but he was half English and half Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. So as part of my own sort of journey, trying to work out what my identity story was. When I was 12, I wrote to the Maori tribe to understand a little bit more about that part of my heritage, and as well as connecting me to ancestors in a very powerful way. They explain this idea of whakapapa, which is, I've learned as a performance coach working all around the world, is a completely universal idea. It's just that they happen to capture it very beautifully. And it's just simply, they explained to me as a 12-year-old that every community you want to think of, I mean, that includes your family, your nation, your school, of course, a really important one, your church, your sports teams, all of these communities you belong to, you should see yourself as one person in this line of people, with your arms interlocked with those people who came before you.
Yes. And
also with those people who come after you. And they explain the metaphor of the sun first shone on the origin story of whatever community that you're talking about, and just slowly moves down this line of people, revealing everybody in turn. And so you were always part of the school, for example, even before you were born in this conception. It's just that over time, you and your role in that becomes revealed. So that's how I understand whakapapa. So it's very important for my coaching, because if you are just one person, a line of people, and the sun moves on to you,
yes,
it's important that you act as a guardian of what that identity and the values and the purpose of that school. It's not all about you. But also when the sun is shining on you, you have a moment in time where you need to work out what's required from us right now. And then finally, you need to also have an understanding of the people who come after you. You've got an obligation to them. So everything you do while the sun's shining on you, you need to create the conditions for them to thrive.
That's a lovely explanation. A school is incredibly diverse environment in a multitude of ways, culturally, socioeconomically, in terms of values and beliefs as well throughout that school, which means that the foundations for that identity, if you like, they come from very different places. And I wondered your view of what education leaders can do, school principals, senior management, and so on, to find the common thread or the desire for belonging within such a diverse organization and build on it. Where do they start the process?
Well, belonging has two dimensions to it. The first one is the signals to an individual that actually you belong here, that you are included, and that we see you and we respect you. So they are the day-to-day signals that we pick up, all of us pick up from every single environment we're in, okay? We're very highly sensitive to these signals. So that's part of belonging. And when those signals are telling you that you're seen here, you're included in this, you belong here, then we are in a completely different hormonal state. Yeah. So our anxiety reduces, oxytocin and dopamine, very important. Energizing hormones start to surge. So as a performance coach, whether it's England football team or whether it's my daughter's school, makes no difference. This is the humanity of this, and this is the hormonal context. So that's part of it, is what signals are being sent to an individual. The other part of belonging, though, is belonging to what? And this is where often this is missed, is it's not just about someone telling you implicitly or explicitly you belong. They need to attach themselves to a story of us, who we are. What is this school? What is the identity of this school? What is its whakapapa? What is its heritage, its past, its story? And by no means that should ever be a fairy tale. That should be just very authentic. But I want that. When I arrive at a school, I do want someone to sit me down and I want someone to explain, this is the story of the school. Yeah. And this is, our values are shorthand for that story. I want people to tell me that. I want to feel energized by that. But I also want to know that now we're all together. What is the chapter of this story that we're writing while the sun's shining on us? Very similar way to we frame the experience with the England football team, but to me, it's the same for a school. And I've got very powerful memories of exactly that at my high school that I went to in New Zealand. It was beautifully captured and really, really quite ubiquitous in our school that this is our origin story. This is why we are here. This is the difference we make. This is the values that we believe in. And then the sun was shining on us and we had multiple opportunities to add to that legacy, add to the story. So to answer your question, there's two dimensions, like making sure the individual is getting those signals that they belong, but also making sure that, especially as leaders, that we have articulated a story for them to attach themselves to.
So that process of developing that origin story, of seeding those values into that organization, into a school or otherwise, and belonging, has to start, I guess, in part with a level of self-awareness within the leaders themselves, to recognize with honesty and with humility the impact, positive or negative, that they are having on the concept or the culture of that school and the concept of belonging. From your perspective, what do leaders need to ask themselves about their own role and leadership style in this process as they start or embark upon their journey of developing it?
It's making sure that the children, their identity has an opportunity to be seen. And I'll give you an example. 5 years ago now, we relocated from New Zealand to England, and we live in the Cotswolds, in a beautiful village in the Cotswolds. And my daughter was actually is a very vivacious, energetic, incredibly sociable girl. And when she was at her nursery or in New Zealand, she was sort of a little bit of the center of attention and a bit of a leader. So, very gregarious. And when we came to her to start school in the Cotswolds, what happened actually is it was a complete transformation in her character, really, her personality. And that when she joined this classroom, the first day, in a completely, literally foreign environment for her, where she didn't know anybody or anything, even about the area, because we sort of went to school a few days after we arrived. The teacher, and not through any ill intent, but just not thinking through how powerful the idea of belonging is, just invited her to sit down in a desk at the very back of the room. Just at the very start of that lesson on that day, just acknowledged that there's a new person starting. Her name's Olivia. She's sitting in the back. And then just left her and hoped some sort of magic was going to form where, the people she was sitting with but these were like 5-year-olds.
Yeah.
And what happened is my daughter became this incredibly anxious little character, and she did not feel she belonged there. She felt it completely like an outsider.
Yes.
And her stress levels were so high that she started to hate to go to school. She started to get very, and to the point where we had to have a chat to the school trying to understand what was going on.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what we did understand was that she needed to be more integrated and woven into the class. Someone needed to actually sit down with her, either teacher, and ask her a little bit about where she's come from and her story. Like literally didn't ask any questions about that at all. She didn't seem seen. And the students were just too young to be able to do it organically. Yeah. But anyway, the start of the next year, when she arrived, a completely different teacher sat her down, said, I know you come from New Zealand. I'd love to hear about that. And just really made her feel like she belonged, feel welcome, and then made sure that she was the center of what the classroom was doing rather than sitting at the very back of it. So, little things like that. It's just, you're right. The term is just a bit more awareness around these things.
So does belonging, or to embed and encase that and embrace that within an organization, does it ultimately need hierarchy within leadership? So a strong, or for want of a better word, leader at the top who takes responsibility and ensures that it's embedded into that organization? Or does it actually need a more flat leadership structure so there are many people to help drive it, to help it to thrive?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear I'll probably say a combination of those two things together. The way I would think about it, and this actually comes again to our Indigenous culture in New Zealand, but I was taught again as a young person that the world is really divided into two things. Tapu, T-A-P-U, which means sacred, and Noa, N-O-A, which means autonomy. And what I was taught was that the best way to navigate the world is for leaders and teams to be clear on what is sacred here, okay, and what is Noa, where there is autonomy. So in a classroom, teachers will have a degree of things that are sacred and have to be done, but non-negotiable, and also things where they have autonomy and they can do things very differently to the classroom next door. And that's great. That's how humans thrive. That's how kids thrive. They like boundaries, but they like autonomy within them. And it's the same principle. It's the sacred and it's the autonomy. Yeah. So in terms of belonging, the way I would say is the leadership, from the top down, should say that we know that we will get the best performance and best learning from our children if they feel they belong in the classroom. They feel included, they feel a sense of belonging. So we make it sacred, non-negotiable, that every classroom and every teacher will have responsibility to bring that out. Now, how you do that, will allow your own personality and life experience to be able to inform that. So we're not going to give you a 5-page document with this is how it must be done. But we do regard us as a school where every single individual should have a sense of belonging. And not only that, what I've seen, and I think it's powerful, is when the school also puts belonging as one of its criteria of success. Yes. Obviously, there's a lot of external bodies who are telling you what success is or what it isn't. Ultimately, it comes to every community to work to define for themselves what success really is. And because we know that a sense of belonging has a fundamental effect on people's ability to grow, why not put that down as one of our markers of success? And we can test that and check that later in the year as well. So if it's everyone working together around this, but it has to have value from the leadership.
I'd like to explore that a little bit more, because you touched on measurement and success and so on, and whether we're in the education sector or any element of business or sport, everything seems to need to be measured today. And I'm sure there are discernible KPIs that you can put around this, but I wondered what some of the softer indications are of the sense of belonging, this adherence to an origin story, are within an educational environment, at least in your view. How do you recognize it in little and big ways day to day, as opposed to just the measurement as you explained at the end of the year?
That's a good point. And in the high performance areas I work in, particularly in sport, there's very little that isn't measured.
Yes.
However, when it comes to setting the environment, which is really what I'm interested in as a performance coach, what is the optimal environment for us to thrive? A lot of this cannot be measured to 2 decimal points. You can't measure to 2 decimal points how someone's sense of belonging. So what we do is, again, I go back to my ancestors. My ancestors in the Polynesian navigators in the Pacific Ocean were probably the greatest navigators in human history. They explored all the way east to South America, all the way north up to Hawaii and beyond, all the way south to New Zealand. They were phenomenal, and they could not measure. They didn't know what a mile was. They could not measure those things. But what they understood intimately was star navigation. And I actually think it's a good analogy for this. You don't have to measure everything exactly precisely in order for it to have value. But what you need to do is actually more important, is knowing cause and effect.
Yes.
So what we know is that if we do certain things in a classroom, we know that the outcome from that will be children feeling less anxiety and feeling a greater sense of belonging and inclusion. Okay, so I doubled down as a coach on making sure the conditions are set and knowing, and through science, of course, that these will have a positive impact on people. And same thing with the football team. I mean, if you ask Gareth Southgate, what's the difference in the sense of belonging of players now than 6 years ago, we could not measure that and give you a nice number. But I think it's pretty obvious if you talk to them and even watching them play, that has shifted so much. So I sort of encourage people a little bit to get away from the micro measurement and actually just be clear in your own mind about cause and effect.
So do you think we are in a sort of heavily data-driven world, and all sectors are? Do you think we're not trusting our gut and our intuition, and that, you know, as you said, you've just identified there, sometimes you just know when things are changing, when culture is changing, when people are lifting, when they feel belonging, but you can't put a data point against it. Do you think we are neglecting that side of the assessment and leadership too much, in that race to sort of measure everything?
Well, actually, the interesting thing about measurement is if we really wanted to, we can do quite a lot in this space. And I'll tell you why. There are some very elite sports teams in the world who have great resources, who actually hormonally profile their players on a week-to-week basis.
Right.
So, for example, and that is very sophisticated, and can be as many decimal points as you actually want.
Yeah.
But, for example, they measure things like, if a team has performed poorly and the coach stands in front of the team and is very aggressive and very critical, maybe pessimistic, but also puts video on the screen of mistakes which socially embarrass players in the team in that environment.
Yeah.
They literally, endocrinologists, i.e. experts in hormones, have measured people's individual hormonal state when they're in that situation. And your cortisol levels, your stress levels rocket, and probably adrenaline kicks in. So you become very de-energized and very fearful. And they've also measured exactly the same situation where a team hasn't performed well, but a coach stands in front of the team with great body language, with optimism, frames it about these are the learning points, and then has individual conversations away from the social group with players who have had a difficult game. And then they've measured their hormones. So this is why the cause and effect, it's not a guess. We know that. We know that if we want to energize people through dopamine and oxytocin and reduce the cortisol in the system, i.e. the chronic stress, then this is a profound effect. So we can measure it if we want to, but that's pretty intrusive, and I don't think we're going to be going around classrooms measuring students' hormonal state. So I think we need to understand the science out there and then just crack on with it. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've got an external agency which is saying these are the things that we can measure and these are the most important things, then I imagine it's incredibly tempting, if not compelling, to focus on all those measurables.
Yeah.
But, I've worked in an elite ballet school as well, where they were aware that the students who had gone through that school, although they'd done incredibly well in terms of professional ballet career, had something like 4 times more likely to have mental health problems later in life.
Wow.
Okay. So then the question that as a performance coach I'm posing to them is, so what's your criteria for success here?
Yes.
Is it just, people passing and getting professional contracts and you being ranked number 1 in the world? Or is it something else? And they stepped forward and said, you know what, you're right. Nothing is encouraging us to measure belonging and well-being, but the evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah.
So they changed their success criteria as a school to include well-being beyond time in the school. And that, therefore, leads to a very fundamental change in their culture and the way they teach people. If you're actually not just trying to have a good result right now, but you're trying to set up people to be successful in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. So that's what I'd encourage all school leaders to do is, again, acknowledge what is being required from you externally, but have a really sacred space to think about what do we really believe is important for our school, and then include it as a success marker.
Really good point. You talk in your book Belonging about the darker side to the evolution of some group cultures as well, and you provide the example of the Australian cricket team's tour of South Africa a few years back when Cameron Bancroft was caught rubbing the ball with sandpaper. And part of the explanation he gave at the time was that he wanted to fit in, to felt he belonged, to do what was asked of him, if you like, even though he knew it was wrong. How do education leaders identify early on when their own culture is turning toxic? Particularly from a student point of view, we all do silly things when we're teenagers to try and fit in, but also from a leadership and a teacher perspective. What are the warning signs for that positive culture of belonging turning perhaps toxic?
Well, we're massively influenced by our peers. There's no question about that.
Yep.
And you and I could probably spend a couple of hours sharing stories about how that's played out when we grew up. So that's all fine, I think what I like in good performance environments, we don't sit around and point at our people and go, good guy, good girl, bad girl, etc. We don't do that. What we do is we are aware that 70% of human behavior is determined by our environment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a meta study based on 1,000 studies from the English Institute of Sport. That is our starting point here.
Yeah.
So if there's a vacuum, people will revert to cliques, and they will be heavily influenced by who happens to be in that clique. So we pray that our kids are in a good peer group, and they'll be positively influenced, but it feels a bit like potluck, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we have to have ownership of our environment. I think what's really important is, and I'm not noticing this in some schools that I've had these conversations with, is that really we are massively influenced by our own values. But sometimes when we haven't gone through a process of defining what on earth they are, is that we're sucked into the values of the group we're with. Mm-hmm. And again, there we start to get in a bit of a lottery situation. So some schools I've noticed, and I really love this, in order to give their students both a sense of belonging and a sense of values that can navigate them through their life, including making tough decisions as a teenager, what they do is they go through this process, and I think it's year 7, for the first term of year 7, and they ask every student to go and do some research on their own origin story.
Right.
So that includes engaging with their parents and their grandparents. Like, where did we even come from? Have we been in this village for 100 years, or have we arrived 3 years ago?
Yeah.
If our family were maybe migrants, maybe even refugees, then we connect the children to that story.
Yeah.
But we also have historians come into the classroom, just explain how online and other ways you can do stuff. We teach them the history of the school and the community the school is within. Some schools are on the coast, they take them to the harbour and explain some of the historical things that happened. So all of this very powerful, but the end game of doing this in the first term of year 7 is that each of the students, they don't tell the class their whole life story, but what they do is they stand there and they share, these are 2 values that I want to take with me for the rest of my life.
Right.
And these are values that have been shaped by my identity story. So for example, a student might, and this is happening in these schools, might say, I feel like I'm a resilient person because my grandparents did not speak English and they came to this community and it was hard for them. They gave up everything. They gave up their family, gave up their jobs, but they visioned that something could be better for us.
Yeah.
Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so they made that sacrifice. So in order to do that, you have to be an incredibly resilient person. And so I'm going to take resilience with me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a value, and other people have other ones. And that, when you get into these tricky situations where you have choices to make as a teenager, to me, if you are anchored in your own values, and that whole process is being curated by your school, how amazing is that? That
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
powerful. And rather than being implicit about it by just being a good school and a good experience, be explicit about it. Literally have a process, a program for them to do it.
Really interesting point that I'd like to explore it a little bit more, because a school's a really complex ecosystem, and it's almost paradoxical in some ways. It's both incredibly consistent. You've got a student who may be at that school for 5 or 10 years in some cases, but at the same time, it's very transient. Lots of students go in and out, and indeed teachers, permanent and temporary teachers, come in and out in that organization over time. And one of the big challenges any leader has in business and sport and education is how you bring new people into a team or a group, people with new experiences and values, as you say, and experience and perspectives, and strike the balance between ensuring that person understands the principles of the culture they're coming into without losing the essence of what makes them great individually as well. What's your advice to sort of education leaders as to how they strike that balance, how they manage the collective and the individual, if you like?
Well, the induction process is so critical. And again, what we're looking for there is to explain to people this is our story as a school.
Yeah.
But then our values are shorthand for this story. So these are literally what we value here. These are the traits that we value here. And actually, what I think is a very powerful thing to do when people come in is, rather than give them a PowerPoint presentation of what these values mean, I think, and I've seen it in my coaching work, what's really powerful when you have a diverse group of people is to say that this is a value of our school. And let's say, for example, honesty.
Yeah.
And then, rather than being prescriptive about exactly what that means, inviting people to explain from their own identity story, their own world experience, their own personal values, what does honesty mean to you?
Yes.
So we're not just asking them that. We're setting it out in a context of, this is a value of the school, and this is where it comes from. This is what it looks like. But we invite everybody to then articulate what that value means for them as an individual. And we sit around and listen to it. And what I've found in all environments is that when someone does that, they actually take a bit of ownership about living the value in the way that they've articulated to the people around them. And to me, it's incomparable to just telling them to memorize what a value is and try and live it.
Yeah.
So, obviously in some sports teams, it's quite intimate, but these become very powerful. And also for a teacher, if a child says, well, this is what honesty means to me, then you can hold them to account to that.
Yeah.
Rather than pointing at, something on the wall and saying, well, you didn't do that. It's much more.
Very true.
So I think it's a combination, a really powerful induction where they need to be embraced in our identity story and what we're trying to do right now. But also making sure that within that process, there's an opportunity for their own personality and point of difference to come through.
Makes sense. So, Owen, I'd like to end this episode, as we will with all episodes, with a bit of a summary of 3 concise and final pieces of actionable wisdom for educational leaders. And we're going to use a variation of the TES acronym to help us embed these points in our minds, so that the T will be for talk. And when it comes to belonging, what's the key thing leaders need to do more effectively to communicate belonging in their school or their college or other educational establishment? What's the one key thing in terms of talking and communicating?
Share a optimistic, energizing story of who we are.
Brilliant piece of advice, actually, yeah. And E is for excite. So when it comes to belonging, what's the most important thing leaders should do to excite those within an organization, to help them to better engage, embrace, and believe in the value of that concept?
To excite your people and to energize your people, what you want them to do is every single day to be sustained by dopamine, that hormone we feel when we're working towards a goal that is meaningful for us, and oxytocin, that hormone that surges when we feel connected to people around us. So putting people connected with this growth and this story that we are creating together and making them feel connected to the people around them, that is excitement and energy.
So you may have just answered the next question with that answer, but S is for sustain. What is one thing leaders could do to ensure they sustain a commitment to belonging over the medium term. So it becomes a core component of an organization's thinking and its culture.
Just continually checking in with students and with your peers around their anxiety levels versus those other hormones we've spoken about. And when people are starting to feel anxious and started to feel alone and a little bit isolated and a little bit excluded, because we've got a beautiful process of always checking in on that, then we are able to grab a hold of it if we need to, and to re-energize it and make sure it's sustainable. But don't let it just lie. Don't let it lie. Check in.
3 great pieces of advice. Oh, and I know you're delivering a performance workshop or performance culture workshop in London in November. Would you like to let the audience know where to go to find out more about this?
Sure. Well, the best way to connect with me would be on LinkedIn. That's probably where I'm spending most of my time. Yes, on November the 15th, we're having a workshop, Harlequins Football Club, and that's for all types of leaders from different. It's going to be quite intimate, very, very practical. And, belonging is part of it, but we're also going to get deep into how we build a values-driven culture as well.
Brilliant.
There's plenty of stuff out there, and, I appreciate you, and I appreciate the fact that we're starting this series thinking about belonging, because that's what it is. It's not everything, but it is absolutely a foundation of a high-performing environment.
Absolutely. Owen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Paul. All the best.
Pleasure. And to everyone tuning in for the first episode of the Leading and Learning series, thank you once again. Join me next month when we'll be speaking to Celine Sillinger, founder and CEO of engagement leadership consultancy We Need Social, and she's the author of Dare to Unlead. To all of those who would like to access leadership content from TES Magazine, visit the TES Magazine leadership website, tes.com/magazine/leadership. And there'll be guides there for middle leaders, interviews with senior education figures as well. And we'll include the link in the notes that accompany this podcast. So finally, I'm Paul, host of the new P&L Principles in Leadership and Business, and guest host for today for this fantastic episode of the TES Leading and Learning webinar series. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, and speak to you next month.